The poverty of Central America and the Third World, masses of people crowded into urban slums, living in utter destitution in rural villages at times, illiteracy, unemployment, hunger, disease, comes because the land is given over to commercial cash export crops and absentee ownership. It comes because they're growing coffee, sugar, beef for export instead of beans and rice for indigenous consumption, home consumption, domestic consumption. The labor and the resources of Central America are devoted to one thing primarily, capital accumulation. Especially emphasis on the labor. I gave the example once of El Salvador, where I was looking at who's in El Salvador. You know who's in El Salvador, the Fortune 500? Everybody. Cargill, General Motors, all these corporations are down there in Central America. Harvester, Chase Manhattan, in El Salvador. And I said, what's in El Salvador? Some sugar, some cotton, what are they all doing there? And they're down there for that other ingredient in the productive process, the one that really creates surplus value, which is human labor. And the Salvadoran workers are producing everything from energy rods to baby powder, to cooking powder, baking powder, rubber tires, computers, automobile parts. All this is being done for other consumption markets. It's called outsourcing, where the companies go down and bring the stuff and use the cheap labor. And all those transportation costs to do that make it worth it. It's still more profitable to do that and to have those things put together in El Salvador than in Ohio, because in Ohio you pay people $10 an hour, and down there you pay them 60 cents an hour. So the labor and resources are devoted to one thing primarily, capital accumulation. Self-sustenance and self-employment gives way to wage labor. And that pattern is very striking in the Third World, throughout the Third World. From 1970 to 1980, the number of wage workers in the Third World grew from 72 million to 120 million. And the rate is accelerating. That same pattern exists in the United States. Back in the middle of the last century, early part of the 1800s, 75% of this population, the U.S. population, was self-employed. Today, it's about 8%. I mean, it's been a gradual decline, 40, 20, 15, you go right down, it's down to about 8 now. And many self-employed people are really self-employed on the sufferance of some other larger supplier. The essence of capital investment is not to uplift a country or develop it, nor to bring civilization. Those are the patronizing ethnocentric rationales that are given. I mean, we do hear that the developed countries in the North must help the underdeveloped countries. What does underdeveloped mean? It means retarded in some way. You just didn't go through a certain process. They're not as capable of evolving. They need aid. They need Peace Corps volunteers to show them how to do things. They need missionaries and movies and McDonald's and Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse, especially Mickey Mouse. And cognizant that underdeveloped carries some negative connotations, the Third World nations and the UN and the Wall Street Journal and most communist parties in the world, publications left, right, and center, all now use another term, which I do not ever use in my writings, a slightly less insulting but hilariously inaccurate term. They're called developing nations. So they're just late bloomers. I use Third World because I find developing to be a very deceptive term, a euphemistic way of saying underdeveloped. It presumes that poverty was an original condition. It presumes that these countries are developing when, in fact, in many of them, the conditions are getting worse. People in these countries don't need to be taught how to farm. They need the land to farm and the implements. They don't need to be taught how to fish. They know how to fish. They need the boats and the nets and access to shore frontage and bays and oceans. They need someone to stop the chemical plants from dumping their toxic effusions into the waters and rivers. They don't need to be convinced that they should use hygienic standards. They don't need a Peace Corps volunteer to tell them that, to tell them to boil their water, especially when they can't find any wood to light a fire with. They need the conditions that will allow them to have clean drinking water and clean clothes and homes. They don't need nutritional advice on balanced diets from North Americans. They need food, and they usually know better than the North Americans what foods serve their nutritional needs, usually. Underdevelopment, what's called underdevelopment, is a condition which is forcefully imposed on these countries through history. One of the most dramatic examples is India. In 1810, India was exporting more textiles, finished mass-market textiles, not just those beautiful, exquisite silks that we always associate with India. Mass-market textiles, was exporting more textiles to England than England was exporting to India, and more to China, and more to Egypt, more to a number of other places. In 1810, by 1830, the British had put up prohibitive barriers and blocked out Indian goods and had moved in and were dumping their goods in India. And within a matter of another 10 years, the great textile centers of Dhaka and Madras were turned into ghost towns. And the people were sent back out on the land to do what? To raise the cotton, the raw materials that would be used in the factories of Manchester and Lancashire and London. So that India was reduced to being a cow, like much of the Third World, to be milked and not to be developed. And by 1850, India's debt had grown to 53 million pounds. And from 1850 to 1900, the per capita income in India dropped by two-thirds, almost two-thirds, 65%. I mean, that's an incredible drop. So we always associate India with poverty, the massive poverty. That's not their original condition. They're not an underdeveloped country. England underdeveloped India. Ireland is another example. Ireland is a country that's not usually associated with the Third World. Well, it's the first colony, England's very first. It was the first imperialism. It goes back to, what, 13th century, 14th century, whatever. Engels was in Ireland, spent some time there. Frederick Engels, Karl Marx's collaborator, for the benefit of some who might not recognize the name. In 1856, he wrote, quote, "How often have the Irish started out to achieve something, and every time they have been crushed politically and industrially. By consistent oppression, they have been artificially converted into an utterly impoverished nation." Very interesting wordage. Artificially converted. And so the same with Central America. Artificially converted. The Mayan Indians in Guatemala had a better diet. They had more calories, more protein, and better conditions of health in the early 16th century before the Europeans came than they do have today. They had more artists, more musicians, more architects, more horticulturalists than they do today. They are not underdeveloped. They've been overexploited. They've been maldeveloped. The legacy of U.S. economic dominance is not only hunger and strife and misery, but an economic structure that bears very little functional relationship to the needs of Central America, of the people of Central America. The most important characteristic of the region's economy is that it's dominated by a network of international corporations which themselves are beholden to parent companies that have their place in North America, Europe, and Japan, roughly in that order, especially North America. If there's any harmonization, by the way, of these interests, it's with the global investor classes. Between them, they're harmonizing their interests. That's what's getting integrated, not the indigenous economies of these countries. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is an attempt to rationalize this. It gives the total green light. It wipes away whatever political controls that democratic forces have been able to institute. NAFTA will not integrate the economies. You hear that talk all the time. These economies are going to be integrated. I heard John Chancellor, that fatuous commentator, wisdom peddler, saying, well, there was a time when we had small villages and we had to move to a regional economy. Then a regional economy wasn't enough. We had to move to a national economy. And now we're all going to have to move to a global economy. Just that's all. Simple as that. That's all it is. A benign, ordinary development. It's not an integration into a global economy because these capital investments, untrammeled as they are, actually fragment the productive forces in these countries, any productive forces that operate for the needs of the people. Just look in our own country. Just look at what free trade and mobility of capital has done to the industrial Midwest of the U.S. We now even have a term for it. We call it the Rust Belt. That's a remarkable admission, isn't it? Well, but it's something that just happened, you see. The Central American economies, like those in most places in the Third World, remain fragmented and unintegrated, both between each other, between the various countries, and within themselves, both in the flow of capital and goods and in technology and organization. A global economy, a world economy that has little to do with the needs of the people of the world. That's a rather remarkable thought when you think about it. Huh? The other legacy of economic domination is political suppression and unspeakable atrocities. The counterinsurgency funded and led by the United States in El Salvador against a broadly based liberation movement led to the deaths of what? By now maybe 70,000 Salvadorans killed. Many thousands more believed to have been murdered by right-wing death squads. 540,000 have fled into exile. Another 250,000 have been displaced or forced into resettlement camps. This is all one little country, El Salvador, a country of only 4 million people. So just about everybody has been directly or indirectly affected, has either suffered death or suffered a terrible loss of loved ones or close ones. The Salvadoran army massacred whole villages suspected of being sympathetic to the guerrillas. An eyewitness victim interview taken by then Congresswoman Barbara Mikulski of a Salvadoran peasant woman, quote, "Many members of my family were killed. I saw children around the age of 8 being raped, and then the soldiers would take their bayonets and make mincemeat out of them. With their guns, they would shoot at their faces. The army cut people up and put soap and coffee in their stomachs as a mocking. They would slit the stomach of a pregnant woman and take the child out as if they were taking eggs out of an iguana. That is what I saw." And El Salvador today, in the U.S. media and by our U.S. political leaders, is called a democracy. Manuel de Conciao, a peasant leader in Brazil, was arrested by the Brazilian security police when the junta ran Brazil. Police who had been schooled at U.S. Army bases in the latest methods of counterinsurgency and interrogation for his crime of protesting the economic conditions of his life and of his people. This is how Manuel was treated. "For 4 months, I was heavily tortured by the army in Rio de Janeiro and then in the Naval Information Center. Near death, I was taken to the hospital for the 6th time. The beatings had been so severe that my body was one big bruise. The blood clotted under my skin and all the hair on my body fell out. They pulled out all my fingernails. They poked needles through my sexual organs and used a rope to drag me across the floor by my testicles. Right afterwards, they hung me upside down by my ankles. They hung me handcuffed from a grating and tied my penis so I could not urinate. They forced me to stand for 3 days without food or drink. They gave me so many drugs that my eardrums burst and I am impotent. They nailed my penis to a table for 24 hours. They tied me up like a pig and threw me into a pool so that I nearly drowned. They put me in a completely dark cell where I remained for 30 days, urinating and defecating in the same place where I had to sleep. They fed me only bread soaked in water. They put me in a rubber box and turned on a siren. For 3 days, I neither ate nor slept, and I nearly went mad." This was done by the defenders of the Western world, by defenders of the free way, you see, the free market, with the aid and the training of the CIA and other such groups. Victims of these military and police defenders of democracy were financed by the U.S., tortured people with electric shock. They forced victims, and this is in El Salvador and in Guatemala, Honduras, not in Panama, not in Nicaragua, not in Cuba. These are the things. They forced victims to witness the torture of friends and relatives, including children. They raped women in the presence of other family members. They burned sexual organs with acid or scalding water. They placed rats in women's vaginas and into the mouths of other prisoners. They mutilated, punctured, and cut off various parts of the body, including genitalia, eyes, and tongue. They injected air into women's breasts and into veins, causing slow, painful death. They shoved bayonets and clubs into the vagina, or in the case of men, into the anus, causing rupture and death. And I have other descriptions that make that one look almost mild, but I'm going to skip them. I think you get the idea. Yet I would argue that imperialism is rational. It harnesses these cruel and horrible and twisted impulses. It enlists them. It instigates them. It instigates them. These guys weren't born torturers. I mean, they didn't go around and say, who's been ripping out the arms of rabbits and chickens? You can come work for us. They took ordinary guys and said, we are going to train you as professionals. And torturers have testified that we are professionals. We use certain methods to elicit information, and we have to do this, and it's a tough job and all that. And the guys who finance them, who sit in Langley, Virginia, say, heck, I mean, it's a jungle out there. I'm not that happy about the kind of methods we sometimes have to use, but when you're facing these tough kind of people, you got to use the same methods they do, and so forth, so on. In other words, you always justify your crimes by saying that your victim was the criminal. That's a rational process of training torturers for what is a rational set of interests. They didn't go down there for torturing, just for the sake of torturing. They used torture in order to be down there and stay down there and defend their privileges and their interests. I want to make that point because sometimes imperial domination is explained as arising from the will to dominate, an innate desire for territorial expansion, a territorial imperative. But in fact, territorial imperialism is not the dominant mode. It hasn't been in generations. Today, there's very relatively little colonial dominion. I mean, the U.S. controls Puerto Rico, Guam, a few other places. What you have today is neo-imperialism, where the country has its nominal independence, its own president and its own currency and its own police and all that. And all you do is you control its exports and imports, its land, as we did with Cuba, sugar, tobacco, its tourist trade, and all those other things. You allow them the trappings of sovereignty while you control the wealth. I heard someone at the World Affairs Council, I went there to hear a friend speak, and someone got up from the audience. There's a lot of academics and professionals and all that, World Affairs Council types. And he said, well, ironically, Cuba has come full cycle since the days before the revolution. Before the revolution, the tourist trade was only for the Yankees. The hotels and beaches were only for the foreigners, and the Cubans needed Yankee dollars to use them. And today, it's the same thing. Ironically, Cuba is back to its pre-revolutionary position. There are beaches for foreigners, the dollar beaches, dollars, because Cuba is so strapped for hard currency. There are hotels where foreigners stay. The Cubans couldn't afford it. They don't have the dollars and all that. So it's the same. And I got up and I said, no, it's not the same, because the surplus value or the profits of the pre-revolutionary trade went to big corporations, gamblers, mobsters, whorehouse owners, and the like, generals on the take and such. And today, the surplus value that is received by the Cubans goes to the government. What the Cubans have done is they said, we have so few hard currency resources. One of them is our sun and our beautiful beaches and all that. Let's try to start a tourist trade and make that a source of hard currency. And that's what they've been doing. But that money goes back to the people and pays for their health clinics and their education and these other things. So Cuba is not in the same place. If Cuba were in exactly the same place it was before the revolution, this government would be hugging and kissing the Cubans. They'd be giving support like they do to Shevardnadze or Yeltsin or Havel or one of those people. We wouldn't still have the blockade and the embargo and squeezing them as is. Until that surplus value, until every penny of it goes back to the few and is taken out of the hands of the many, there will be antagonism toward Cuba. The U.S. policy toward Central America for almost 2 centuries has consisted of the 3 I's: interference, invasion, and investment. It's not the outgrowth of any kind of democratic national dialogue or consensus. between the American people and their leaders. It's not the response to democratic pressure. It's not the result of mass jingoism, a longing for invasion or power expansion or war or popular hysteria. The history books tell us that about the Spanish-American War, that it was a popular hysteria. I've done my study of it. Most people in 1898 weren't interested in going to war. They were trying to get jobs. The labor movement in the U.S. had very little interest in overseas expansion, and in fact was, for the most part, opposed. Not all. The same with the Gulf War, a very jingo war. In July 90, most Americans, opinion polls showed, most Americans favored negotiated settlements, which is what the Iraqis also favored. It was only after several months of media war hysteria and White House war hysteria and piping it up and pumping it up and the actual commitment of troops and the promise of a quick, easy win that the U.S. public got on its yellow ribbon binge. And even at the time, some of you may remember, I said they're going to develop a postpartum depression. They're going to come down from this yellow ribbon high, and the American people have the habit of then drifting off into reality, and they have to forcefully be shoved back to face the harsh illusions of the ruling elites. And indeed, that happened. The conqueror, George Bush, the guy who was at a 93% approval rating by the end of it, couldn't even beat Bill Clinton in the election. So that kind of jingoism, when it is hyped up, is ephemeral and short-lived. In other words, these policies of invasion, interference, and investment do not come because we want them. I make this point because it's an important thing. I remember being at the City University of New York on a panel. Michael Harrington was on it and he was speaking, and somebody from the audience said,